Don't forget, my novel, The Gryffyn Chronicles, Volume 1, is available on Amazon.com. The link to that book is in the description below. Don't miss your chance to read it. It's available on Kindle, paperback, and hardcover. I would love to hear what you guys think about my book. My name is Karen Miller. Back in 1995, I was working as a registered nurse at a small hospital in Michigan. I loved my job. Even though the hours were long and the night shift could wear me down, I loved it. I lived in a little rented house on the outskirts of town, close enough to Lake Michigan that I could smell the water when the wind was just right. That summer, I shared the place with my younger sister Julie. She had just moved in with me after finishing college and was trying to figure out what to do next. Julie was always the adventurous one, the type to suggest a late-night drive just because the moon was full, or to go exploring the woods after a heavy rain because the forest just smells better that way. She had this contagious energy that I appreciated, even though I usually was too tired to join her antics. We both loved nature though, and on my rare day off, we'd go for hikes or picnics. She'd normally find the spot and I would just tag along. And that's how we ended up planning this little outing that would change our lives forever. You see, Julie had read about a hiking trail near the Manistee National Forest, a spot that was supposed to have a nice view of trees and some wildlife. It wasn't far from the hospital, maybe a 40-minute drive, and she begged me to go check it out with her. So after a couple of days of her pestering, I finally gave in. It was early August, warm but not too hot. We packed a little cooler with sandwiches and bottled water and headed out for the afternoon. The trail was tucked away down some gravel road, so it took some effort to find, but Julie's enthusiasm just kept us going like normal. By the time we parked and set off on foot, I was actually looking forward to the fresh air and the quiet. While we were on that trail, we didn't see another soul. It was just us. The woods were thick, but there was a path wide enough to follow without much trouble. Julie kept pointing out little things. Chipmunks darting across logs, mushrooms growing in the shade, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. I could see why she loved places like this so much. It was just serene and relaxing. After about an hour of walking, we reached a clearing with a fallen tree that made the perfect spot to sit. The view was peaceful, just rows of tall pine trees stretching out as far as I could see. So we sat there, ate our sandwiches, talked about random things, and sat in silence for a while, just soaking all of nature's beauty in. If I'd known what was coming next, I might have just begged Julie to leave right then and there. But nothing seemed strange at the time. It was just a quiet afternoon in the woods. After we finished eating, Julie wanted to keep exploring. She pointed to a narrow trail, branching off from the main one, and said, "Let's see where that goes." I was hesitant at first. The trail looked overgrown, and I wasn't thrilled about wandering too far off the beaten path, but Julie had that look in her eye, the one that meant she wasn't taking no for an answer. So I gave in, just for a little while. The farther we went, the quieter the forest seemed to get. It was subtle at first, but I started noticing how muffled everything sounded. Julie didn't seem bothered by it though. She was a few steps ahead of me, brushing aside branches and hopping over roots like she was on some kind of wild adventure. We came across a small stream, barely more than a trickle of water, and it was cutting through the dirt. Julie crouched down to look at some animal tracks in the mud. The prints were bigger than anything I'd expect to see around here. They weren't shaped like a dog's or a bear's either, more like this exaggerated paw with long toes and claws. Even after seeing the prints, Julie wanted to keep going. I didn't argue, but something about those tracks just kind of stuck with me. They gave me this weird, uneasy feeling, like we shouldn't be there. And then the trail started to climb after that, leading up a slope where the trees grew thicker and the light barely even broke through. It felt darker there, even though it shouldn't have, because it hadn't been any later than 3 in the afternoon. And that's when I noticed this really gross smell. It hit me all at once, like something rotting and wet mixed with this musky animal stink, and I stopped in my tracks, covering my nose with my hand. Julie smelt it too and asked what it was. I shook my head, scanning the trees around us. The smell was so strong it made my stomach flip over. Julie took a step closer to me, and for the first time that day, she didn't look so sure of herself. "We should probably head back," I suggested. She hesitated, glancing up the trail like she still wanted to keep going. Then there was a sound like this hoarse growl that sounded almost human, but too deep to actually be human. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't loud, but it cut through that silence like a knife. We turned around and started walking fast, almost jogging. That weird noise had done its job. It was getting us back to where we should be, back on the main trail. But that smell, it seemed to follow us, and it seemed to grow stronger with each step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, but the trail behind us was empty. But then that noise came again. Closer this time, but I swear to you, it almost sounded like some unnatural, deep laugh at the end. I grabbed Julie's arm, and we broke into a run. We didn't stop until we were back in the clearing where we'd eaten lunch. Both of us were out of breath, our faces flushed. We didn't waste any time packing up the cooler and heading back to the car. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was definitely out there, and I had that weird feeling of being watched. The hike back felt endless. Even though we were retracing our steps, everything looked different, like the forest had shifted around us or something. Julie stayed close to me, unusually quiet for someone who was usually so fearless and so chatty. Then we heard it again. Only this time, after that hoarse growl, movement came from behind us, and then that strange growling laugh again. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like something big was following, matching our pace. I stopped walking and grabbed her arm, asking her if she heard it. She nodded and looked at me with this pale face. She looked like she was embarrassed to admit something, and she said, "Yeah, it's been behind us for a while." That really got my heart pumping, let me tell you. I scanned the trees, but didn't see anything. I wanted to know what it was that she was talking about. And that feeling of being watched was now so strong, it was like a weight pressing down on my chest. I asked her what she was talking about, but she just whispered she didn't know, and that we should keep moving. I didn't argue. I really wanted to get out of the forest at that point. We started walking faster, and the cooler was bouncing awkwardly in Julie's hands. The sound behind us grew louder, crunching leaves, snapping branches, even heavy footfalls. Whatever it was wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. My instincts were telling me that this thing was getting ready to attack. And then that putrid smell hit us again. But it was worse this time, if that was even possible. It was so strong it actually made my eyes water. It was that same wet, rotting stench mixed with an animal musk. I gagged, trying to breathe through my mouth, but it didn't help. Julie covered her nose with her arm, and her steps started faltering. She said, "Karen, I think it's getting closer." That scared me even more than I was already scared. I could feel the shiver go all the way down my back, leaving goosebumps all over me. And that's when it happened. There was this crashing sound to our left, like something barreling through the underbrush. We both froze, and I turned my head just in time to see it. At first, I thought it was a bear standing up, but it wasn't a bear. It was covered in coarse dark fur that looked black in the shadows. The arms were long and muscular, the kind of limbs that didn't belong on any normal animal, and it looked completely buff. The claws at the end of the hands, or paws, I wasn't sure, looked sharp enough to tear through anything. Its head was wolf-like, with a long snout and pointed ears that twitched as it stared at us. The eyes were bright yellow and so piercing it felt like they were burning right through me. And its mouth was slightly open. It had teeth that were too large and jagged, almost like a predator's worst nightmare. It stood there, half hidden by the trees, its chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. The thing didn't move right away. It just watched us. Julie gasped and took a step back, and that small movement seemed to snap it out of whatever trance it was in. Now it seemed agitated. It let out this low growl, the kind that you can feel in your bones. And then it shifted forward, and you could see just how massive it really was. This thing was taller than any man that I'd ever seen. I'd put it between 7.5 to 8 feet tall. Its legs were shaped almost like a dog's, bent at that weird angle that looked unnatural for something standing upright. But it balanced perfectly, like it had been doing that forever. My brain was screaming. One part of it was trying to figure out what the hell we were looking at. The other part was telling us to run. But my legs wouldn't cooperate. Julie grabbed my arm, and she started shaking me. "Karen, we have to go." That snapped me out of the trance that I was in. I turned and bolted, dragging Julie with me. The cooler crashed to the ground behind us. We weren't getting slowed down by it. No way. We ran as fast as we could, but I could hear it behind us. It was crashing through the trees. I could hear rocks and whatever else was on the ground getting kicked up as this thing ran. The snarling was furious. I think it was mad that we were getting away or something. I don't know how we managed to even keep running. My legs felt like they were on fire and my chest ached from gulping in air, but the thought of that thing catching up to us kept me moving. The sound of it crashing through the woods was deafening now, like it wasn't even trying to avoid the trees anymore, like it was just tearing through them. It let out this howl, long, loud, and so unearthly it made every hair on my body stand on end. It was like a mix of a wolf's howl and something deeper and angrier, and I swear it echoed in my head long after it stopped. It made my ears ring. Julie tripped. I heard her yelp as she went down, hitting the ground hard. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding even faster than I ever thought it could possibly beat. She was scrambling to her feet by the time I even got to her. "I'm fine," she yelled. "Let's go." But it was too late. I could feel it before I saw it. This heavy, oppressive presence, like all the air had been sucked out of the forest. I looked up and saw it coming. The Dogman burst out of the trees onto the trail about 20 feet behind us. It moved so fast it was unbelievable. The way it ran was terrifying, almost like a wolf, but its limbs were so long it made its movements jerky and unnatural. We took off again, but it was gaining on us. I could hear its growls getting louder, and I could feel the ground shaking with its steps because of the bulk that it had. I couldn't look back. That would slow me down. Then up ahead, I saw a break in the trees, and the most beautiful thing that I'd ever seen in my entire life. The car. We were almost there. I screamed at my sister to run to the car. She didn't argue. She let go of my hand and sprinted ahead, her arms pumping as she ran for the parking area. I stayed right behind her, my lungs burning and my heart feeling like it was going to burst right out of my chest. The growls were so close now I could practically feel its breath on the back of my neck. Honestly, I don't know how we made it. I don't know if it let us go, or if it was just trying to chase us out of there. But we burst out of the trees and into the clearing where the car was parked. Julie yanked the passenger side door open and jumped in. I was right behind her. I slammed the door shut and locked it just as this thing hit the side of the car. The whole vehicle rocked with the impact, and we both screamed. Julie was crying. I remember her hands gripping the dashboard. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly it took me 2 times. The engine came to life. I threw the car into reverse without even looking back. The Dogman was still there, trying to circle the car now. Its claws were scraping against the metal. It bared its teeth at us. I could see the rage on its face. Looking back on that vivid image in my head at that moment, it looked like the face was almost human. At least the expression on its face was. It let out another snarl and slammed its body against the car, leaving this massive dent in the driver's side door. I floored it, but the thing chased us. It stopped short of the road, standing there at the edge of the forest, now back on 2 legs. Julie sat curled up in the passenger seat the whole way home. She was shaking. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself. If I hadn't been driving, I would have done the exact same thing. But I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. When we finally pulled into the driveway, neither of us moved right away. We did eventually go inside, locking every door and window behind us. I know a lot of people say that they did that, but when you see something like that creature out there, your first instinct is to just barricade yourself somewhere that you feel safe. We still hadn't even said a word to each other when we did that. I even dragged a chair in front of the back door, as if it would somehow stop something as strong as the thing we saw. Julie sat on the couch staring at the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest. That night, neither of us slept. I was so shaky still that I couldn't barely even function. We were both terribly jumpy. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing. Of course, we'd both heard about the Michigan Dogman, but those were supposed to be superstitious kids' stories, right? Wrong. The Michigan Dogman, 100% real. I can testify that. Julie tried to look up information the next day, but this was before the internet made things easy. I didn't tell anyone at work either. Oh, by the way, I saw the Michigan Dogman in the woods yesterday when he chased me and my sister out. They'd have me laughed right out of the hospital, or sent me to psych. Julie didn't tell anyone either. I guess it just became this unspoken rule between us. We didn't talk about it unless we were alone, and even then, we kept it short. For a while, I couldn't even go near the woods. I avoided hiking and camping, anything that meant being surrounded by trees. Even driving past the edge of the forest on my way to work gave me a tight, uneasy feeling in my chest. Julie didn't bring up hiking again either. I could tell that experience we shared had shaken her to her core. Eventually, though, life did go on. Work kept me busy, and Julie moved out about 6 months later to start a job in Chicago. We don't talk much about that day now. It still feels like something that belongs in the past. A nightmare we just don't want to relive. But every once in a while, when I hear a strange noise outside at night or catch the scent of wet fur on the wind, I think about it. I'll never step foot in those woods again. Thanks for reaching out to me. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your patience with me. You know how scary these encounters are, and I appreciate the patience that you have. Have a good one. Karen. My name isn't important, and I'm not the kind of person who ever believed in monsters. Nothing like that was supposed to exist. You'll have to forgive me, but I don't want to give details that could lead people to figuring out who I am, because I don't want that kind of attention. I just need to share this story and get it off my chest. I'm just a regular mom, a widow that's trying to get by raising her little boy. We'll just call him Tommy, for the sake of this email. He was 6 years old when this happened, full of energy and always into something. We lived on a small farmhouse in northern Michigan, just outside of town, so small that it didn't even have a stoplight. Life there was quiet. Some might say boring, but I always liked it that way. Most of my days were spent taking care of the house and the animals and Tommy. My husband Joe passed in an accident when Tommy was 3. That was hard. Really hard. I did what I had to hold down the fort, though, and make life that Tommy could enjoy possible. There's not much excitement around here. Just the usual small-town life with an endless list of chores to keep me busy. I worked part-time at the grocery store, and luckily, Joe had a good life insurance policy that keeps us going. That's why the day that all of this started, it was just normal. I'd promised Tommy we'd check out this patch of woods not too far from the house. Sometimes people dump old junk there, and he loves finding treasures. Normally, I wouldn't let him go poking around in a place like that, but he'd been so good lately, I figured it couldn't hurt to let him have a little adventure. Besides, Joe's death anniversary was coming up in about 3 weeks, and I just needed to do something to take my mind off of it. So having a fun adventure and seeing my little boy smile seemed like the right recipe. Looking back, I wish I'd just stayed home and told him no. We headed out mid-morning just after breakfast. I packed a couple of snacks for Tommy, grabbed a flashlight just so he could play with it, and told him to put on his boots. He was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. The spot we were headed wasn't far, maybe just a 15-minute walk from the house, just past this old fence line that hadn't been maintained in years. The woods back there were thicker than they were up front by our house. The trees grew so close together that sunlight barely made it through, and the air always felt cooler because there was never any sunlight. Joe used to joke about the place being haunted, but I always thought it was just because nobody ever went back there. And that was a place me and Joe used to go to spend time together before Tommy was born. But that was a whole nother lifetime now. As we walked, I started noticing how quiet it was. Just the occasional giggle from Tommy as he ran ahead. He was swinging a stick like a sword. I told him, "Stay where I can see you." And he yelled back, "I'm just looking, Mama." He was so happy. We reached the spot in no time. And like I said, it wasn't much to look at. Just a small clearing with some old rusted out appliances and piles of trash. Tommy ran straight for what looked like an old metal toolbox and started digging through it. "Look, Mom, tools," he yelled, and he held up this rusty wrench like he'd struck gold. I smiled at him and just let him explore while I was leaning against this tree, keeping an eye on him, enjoying the quiet. My mind drifted to Joe. How it would be if the two of them were playing together. We'd never know now. I guess I was so wrapped up in my thoughts that I didn't notice the animal noises right away. But Tommy did, and he pointed out that he heard something growling. I strained my ears to see what he was hearing, but I didn't hear anything. Just in case, though, I told him to come close to me. I knew there was wildlife out there, but I never had a problem with anything up to this point. He didn't argue, which was unusual for him, so I knew he must have been spooked. He dropped the wrench and came running over to me, and I could see how wide his eyes were. "Mama, what was that noise?" I told him I didn't know, but just in case we should probably head back. I guess I was getting kind of spooked too. We started walking back the way we came, and that's when I had this overwhelming feeling of maternal instinct. Every step we took, I swear, I felt this ominous presence growing stronger, to the point where I actually stopped and looked around for something that could be causing it. My mom taught me during my pregnancy to always trust that maternal instinct, and I wasn't going to ignore that now. Something inside me just told me that something was wrong. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Still, I couldn't shake this sixth sense that something was following us, staying just out of sight. "Mama, I'm scared," Tommy told me, and he started tugging at my arm. We hadn't gone much further when he suddenly froze, and his little hand tightened around mine, and he yanked me to a stop. "Mama, there's something over there." I followed his gaze, and I could feel my heart start to beat faster. At first, I didn't see anything, but then something moved. It was quick, and just between the trunks, but it was there. I told him it was probably just a deer, but he said, "No, it's not. It's standing up." And that's when I saw what he was talking about too. It was still hiding behind the trees, but too big to actually be completely hidden. I wanted to scream. This thing was tall and large, way taller than any person. And it looked like a wolf, but not like any wolf that I'd ever seen. Its muzzle was larger, its ears were more cropped like a Doberman's, and the body was covered in this thick fur. Think like a German Shepherd or a Husky, and that's the length. Then I noticed it had a hand wrapped around the trunk of a tree, like it was trying to hide behind it. And I took in what the limbs looked like too. Its arms were irregularly long, like something from a scary movie, and the long fingers, instead of stubby little toes, came out of that hand. It wasn't like any other canine. This wasn't natural. It just couldn't be. This thing didn't move at first. It just stood there behind the tree watching us. But then its lips pulled back, and I swear, it looked to me like it was smiling this wicked, malicious smile. I saw fangs that looked sharp enough to tear through anything. Maybe in just one bite. "Tommy," I whispered, "listen to me. When I say run, you run, okay? Don't look back. Just go." He nodded at me, and I could see the tears streaming down his face. But I wasn't going to let this thing get to him. And then, this monster took a step away from the tree. It was so big, I knew I wasn't going to stand a chance against it, but I was going to fight long enough to get Tommy away from it. It let out this low growl that said to me, "I'm going to kill you," and I could feel its gaze, like it was daring me to make a move. Then I yelled at Tommy to run. He took off like a shot. This thing watched him, and I stood there for a second waiting for him to follow, but it just stood there. That gave me a chance to take off too, and I was right behind him. My legs started to feel like jelly almost instantly. I'm not in the best of shape, but the fear kept me moving. All I could think about was keeping Tommy safe and getting him home. I yelled at him to run faster. That thing let out this horrible sound that was halfway between a howl and a roar, and I felt my chest tighten. We broke through the tree line, the sight of our house in the distance giving me a surge of hope. Go inside, I screamed at him. "When you get there, lock the door." Tommy ran up to the porch steps and disappeared inside, slamming the door behind him. I turned to face the woods, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. That thing had stopped at the edge of the trees, and it just stood there, breathing hard itself, and now it was on 4 legs. For a moment, I thought it might charge, but instead, it let out this growl that was so loud I could hear it even in the distance between us. And then this thing slowly began walking towards the house, with this weird, sloping walk. I yelled to Tommy to open the door. He unlocked it and I ran inside, and then I locked the door immediately after that. I grabbed him, holding him as tight as I could. I had just started catching my breath, clutching Tommy close, when I heard it outside. I peeked out the window, my hands trembling. At first I couldn't see anything, but then I saw it again. It was there, pacing back and forth just beyond the porch. It was on all 4s, and even then, it looked like some kind of twisted wolf. Its body was hunched and its movements were unnervingly fluid. I pulled away from the window and pressed my back against the door, while Tommy ran and hid behind the couch. I heard the porch boards creak. I froze. It was just outside the door. I could actually hear the claws clicking against the wood as it moved. I could hear it sniffing under the door, like it was searching for a way in or trying to get a whiff of me. I scooted away from the door, and Tommy ran out from his hiding spot into my arms. I think he was too scared to even still cry. I kept Tommy close and forced myself to think. There was no way I could stay here alone with this thing outside. I grabbed my phone. I called my brother Dave. He lived just a few miles away and had always been the kind of guy who'd show up in a second if you needed him. I told him what was happening, about the thing we'd seen in the woods and how it was now in my yard, and I was scared that it was trying to get into the house. He didn't hesitate. He said he'd be right over and told me to keep the doors locked. I didn't tell Tommy what was going on, but he must have known it was bad, because he stayed quiet, and his little arms were wrapped around me while we waited. I just kept staring at the door. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 10 minutes before I saw Dave's truck bouncing down the driveway. The creature must have seen him too, because it let out another one of those howls. I ran to the window, chancing a glance. I saw Dave step out of his truck with his rifle in hand. I could see him scanning the yard. I could see how tense he was. I opened the door just enough to tell him that it was still out there. He told me to stay inside and to keep Tommy safe. I watched from the window as he moved across the yard. He made eye contact with that creature. But that thing didn't run. It actually stood its ground, crouched low near the edge of the porch. It didn't seem afraid of him at all, and it didn't seem afraid of the gun. Dave, on the other hand, was stiff and apprehensive but determined to get that thing away from us. And then Dave raised his rifle and he fired. The sound was deafening. I flinched and I pulled Tommy closer. I saw the creature jerk from the shot, but it didn't go down. It just let out some terrible snarl, and then this screech. A screech that I will hear in my dreams for the rest of my life. It bolted. It disappeared into the woods faster than I thought anything that big could actually move. Dave ran over to the porch, and I flung the door open to get him inside. When he came in, he looked shaken. He said he was sure he hit it, but it hadn't even slowed down. Whatever that thing was, it could take a bullet, no problem. He didn't think it was safe for us to stay at the house, not with that thing still out there. I didn't argue. I didn't want to stay at that house alone either. I packed a bag for me and Tommy. Just the essentials. He grabbed some toys, and we followed Dave back to his place. Going outside was probably the scariest moment of my life. I had seen how fast it moved. It could come back in an instant. It could pounce on us while we were walking to the car. Dave waited for us to load up, his rifle at the ready. He didn't get in his truck until we were already moving down the driveway. His house was smaller, but felt so much safer. It felt like the walls were thick and protective, and it had fewer windows. He said he'd keep watch just in case, but I didn't think either of us got much sleep that night. On one hand, I was sure that it wouldn't follow us, but there was a worrying part of my mind that was afraid that it would come to Dave's house to finish what it had started. I stayed with Dave for the next few days. Tommy clung to me. I kept glancing out the windows. Dave checked on our house during the day but didn't see any sign of the creature returning. He said it was probably gone, but I could tell he wasn't 100% convinced. Even after a few days at Dave's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that that creature wasn't really gone. Every time I thought about going back home, my chest tightened up, and my stomach knotted up. It wasn't just fear, it was like my instincts were warning me that we would never be safe there again, and I listened to those instincts. Dave told me I couldn't live in fear forever, that whatever was out there probably moved on, but he didn't push me to go back either, and I was grateful for that. He must have seen how shaken I was, and I think part of him was just as shaken up. He had faced that creature. He got a better look at it than I did, probably. He shot at it. I ran from it. I don't know which situation was scarier. But you know what? Tommy wasn't his normal self either, and that was the most important part to me. Normally, he'd be bouncing back by then, asking questions and trying to make sense of everything, but he stayed quiet, sticking to my side like glue. When he did talk, it was to ask if the monster would come back. I couldn't lie to him. I didn't have an honest answer. And because he was so scared, that's when I made up my mind. We couldn't stay in that house. Not after what happened. Not after the Dogman encounter. Not after Joe's passing. It just wasn't about the creature anymore. It was about what it had done to us. It didn't feel safe to be there. And I couldn't live with one eye on the window the whole time, just waiting for something to happen. On top of that, the memories of Joe surrounding the place. This was just the breaking point. We were leaving. My parents had moved to Indiana a few years back, and that's where I decided to go. I'd talked to them on the phone a few times since everything happened, but I hadn't told them the whole story. Just that something had scared me bad enough to want to leave the house. I knew they wouldn't ask too many questions. I said I just wanted to move closer to them. I told Dave about my decision, and he didn't try to talk me out of it either. He said he'd help me pack and offered to keep an eye on the place until I figured out what to do with it. It took a couple of weeks to get everything in order. I didn't go back to the house alone, not one single time. Dave was always with me, and even then, I never stayed longer than I had to. Packing felt like walking through a memory that I wanted to just leave behind. And Tommy, he seemed relieved when I told him we were moving. Any adventures that he'd had out in those woods, they were now replaced by the memory of that monster. He asked me if that monster could come find us in Indiana, and I promised him that it couldn't. I didn't know if that was true, but it was the only thing I could say to make him feel better. By the time we left, the leaves had mostly fallen and the air had turned to this bitter cold. Dave helped load up the last of the things in the truck, and I could see the worry on his face. He didn't say much, just told me to call if I ever needed anything. I hugged him tight, grateful for everything that he'd done, and I promised that I wouldn't go a day without calling him. I told him to be safe too, because he still had to live there, and now he knew what was out there. He told me that he was going to be careful, and that he wouldn't go in the woods anywhere without his rifle. Admittedly, part of me felt sad to leave. It had been our home for years, and it really was a place full of great memories. But on the contrast, it also had some horrible memories. It was a place that me and Joe had made a home, but now I knew it wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't our home. It was somewhere where we were traumatized. It could never be the same again. We've been in Indiana for 5 years now. Life is good. We live in the city, away from the woods. I never remarried. Joe was my guy, and I feel like that part of my life is over. It's just me and my boy now. He's 11, doing great in middle school, and made a lot of new friends here. My name is Martha, and I have lived on a farm in northern Michigan for most of my life. I married my husband Hank when I was 22, and he took over the farm from his father not long after that. We've been here for nearly 30 years now, raising crops, a small herd of cattle, and 3 kids who've all grown up and moved out. It's quiet here, which is just how we like it. The farm is a good size, around 50 acres, with the back fields running right up to the stretch of thick woods that seem to go on forever and ever. It's an ideal place, and it really was heaven on earth for a long time. Hank and I have always worked hard to keep this place running. He handles most of the heavy lifting, but I've always been right by his side, feeding the animals, tending the garden, and doing all things that keep the farm running smooth. Life out here is simple, but it does have its quirks. Some nights, the woods feel alive, like they're watching you. I can't explain it, but it's a feeling I've had since I was a little girl growing up in this area. Over the years, we've lost a few chickens, and even a calf or two to predators. It's just part of farm life, and you learn to live with it. Coyotes and bobcats wander through from time to time, and I've seen a wolf once, but not in years. Still, Hank and I always keep a shotgun handy just in case something gets too close. But what I saw that night wasn't like anything I'd ever imagined. It wasn't a wolf, or a coyote, or any other animal that I've ever heard of, and that most people haven't heard of either. It was something else entirely. And it's my opinion that it's something from another world entirely. It was a hot July evening. Everything was still out there making noise. Hank had gone into town earlier to pick up some feed, and I stayed behind to finish up the chores. I'd just shut the barn doors after checking a cow when I noticed how quiet it was. Normally, you'd hear the crickets or the few frogs by the pond, but that night, it went from lively to dead silent. Even all our cows seemed uneasy, shifting around and snorting softly, like they were spooked. I shrugged it off at first. Sometimes animals pick up on things that we don't. A storm coming, a stray dog nearby, anything really. I figured maybe a coyote was lurking nearby the tree line or something, and didn't think much more of it. But as I made my way back to the house, I heard something large in the woods clumping around, not being quiet by any means. So I stood there for a moment, trying to place it. It wasn't a deer. They move quiet, even when they're running. It wasn't a bear either. We don't get many of those around here. And when they do come through, they don't make noise like that unless they're tearing into something. This was different, and I forced myself to keep walking, despite the curiosity that was looming inside of me. By the time I reached the porch, I could hear the sound of footsteps. 2 of them, not 4. Not like you'd expect from an animal. They stopped just as I turned to take a look. The yard behind me in the barn was empty. So I went inside. I locked the door. I tried to shake off the feeling. Hank would be home soon after all, and I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe just someone walking through the woods and getting closer to the farm than I'm used to. I just finished putting the kettle on for tea when I heard the footfalls again through the open window in the kitchen. But this time those footsteps were much, much closer. So I grabbed the shotgun that Hank always kept by the back door and stepped cautiously to the window. I hadn't heard the truck pull up, so Hank was still on his way home, which meant it wasn't him walking around out there. Which meant I was alone. There shouldn't be somebody walking around out there at all. My hands trembled slightly as I peered through the glass. I was scanning the dark yard and the edge of the woods. I thought for sure that there was somebody on our property. The moon was full, and it cast a dim light over the area. At first, the little bit of movement I saw made me think it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I try to be as practical as possible, but as I squinted trying to make sense of it, I saw something that didn't make sense at all. This figure was stood up on 2 legs. Its shape unlike an animal, but too large and deformed to be a man. It moved like it was part human, but also part something else. There was no mistaking it now. It wasn't a person. It sure as hell wasn't anything like a bear or wolf either. They don't stand up like that. I got a better look after that. More details, and my heart pounded in my chest as I took in every detail. This creature was huge. It was standing over 7 feet tall, and its body was covered in this dark fur that made it look almost black in the moonlight. Its arms hung low, reaching almost to its knees, and they were way too long for any man that I'd seen. The shape of its head was wrong too. It wasn't shaped like a bear or wolf, but like something that had no business being in the woods behind my house. It looked my way, and I know that it knew that I had seen it. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like time stopped. Then it just stepped backwards into the shadows, like it was trying to conceal itself now. I didn't dare move. My fingers tightened on the shotgun, actually, but I was too scared to even raise it. My mind was abuzz, trying to make sense of what the hell it was that I was looking at. I'd heard stories, of course, about things lurking in the woods. Some folks around here talk about the Dogman, but I never put too much stock in it. It was just some local legend, right? But what I saw tonight, it wasn't a legend. It was real. I was stood, frozen by the window, my hand still gripping the shotgun, my heart hammering in my chest. It felt like forever before I could pull myself together enough to even move. It didn't belong in the woods behind my house, and yet there it was, standing just a few dozen yards away. The fear had a hold on me, tight and cold, like a vice around my chest. My thoughts kept spinning in circles, trying to figure out what to do, trying to rationalize what it could be. But all my mind could come back to, over and over, were those stupid legends. I knew I couldn't just stand there like an idiot, hiding in the dark. If it came closer, if it tried to get into the house, I had to be ready. Honestly, I don't know how long I even stood there, staring at the spot where that thing had been. I guess I was just trying to see if it was going to come back out of the trees. Eventually, I backed away from the window, my shotgun still in my hands, and I slowly made my way through the house. But at that point, my house, the one that I have built a home out of, that I have loved for years, felt smaller than it ever had. The walls felt like they were closing in around me. I made my way to the front door. I locked it tight. Then I moved to the back door and did the same thing. And then I stood back in the kitchen for what felt like forever, listening for any signs of Hank's truck. I was hoping that it would pull up into the driveway soon, but it didn't come. That's when I heard something else. The sound of something heavy scraping along the side of the house, just outside of the kitchen window. I ran to the window and slammed it shut. I held the shotgun close to my chest. My fingers were tight on the trigger. My whole body felt like it was frozen in terror. I couldn't even bring myself to check the window again, but I knew that it was out there. The sound continued for a few more minutes, slow and rhythmic, like whatever it was had no intentions of leaving. It was the most unnerving thing that I'd ever heard. I tried to steady my shaking hands, but it was no use. I knew that I would have to act quickly if this thing got more aggressive, but it was no use. The fear had me trapped in my own home. And then, without warning, there was this loud bang that came from the back of the house. It sounded like someone had slammed into the wall. I jumped damn near out of my skin. Was it the creature? Was it trying to break in? I stood there, listening to where the sound came from, the shotgun pointed at the wall. I don't know if that thing was going to try to break through the wall or something, but if it did, I was pulling the trigger. I just stood in that damn kitchen, the shotgun aimed high, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I didn't know how much longer I could even keep it together. And then, I heard Hank's truck engine in the distance. I'd forgotten to close another window in the living room. I ran to it, wanting to shut it, but thinking maybe that I shouldn't. Maybe I should leave it open a crack so I could hear what was going on outside. Hank's truck was faint at first, but it was there, and it was getting closer. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I started to worry about what would happen when Hank pulled up and saw that thing, or if that thing was ready for him when he got out of his truck. And I knew I had to hold it together for my husband. I wasn't sure how I was going to explain what was happening, but I knew I had to get him into the house safely. When he finally pulled into the driveway, I stood on the porch, yelling at him and waving the shotgun in the air. Seeing him, I almost felt like I could breathe again, but still I needed to make sure that he was safe first. He rushed to the door, and I pulled him inside quickly. His expression was pale. He saw the shotgun in my hands, and he was worried. He immediately asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. How could I? How could I explain that I'd saw something that looks like a werewolf standing on our property, and that I thought that it was messing with me and banging on the house? I didn't have a choice. I had to tell him what I saw. I told him something was in the woods. Something big. It looked like a wolf, standing on two legs. But I felt my voice catch in my throat as I tried to explain the wolf portion of that. Still, I talked on. I said I saw it. I saw it just outside of the window. I saw it over there on our property. That it was moving back and forth, and that it was taunting me. It wasn't like anything that I'd ever seen before. He frowned at the shotgun in my hands again and asked what the hell I was talking about. I started babbling at that point. Again, I repeated that there was a wolf on 2 legs, that it was huge, 7 feet tall, maybe even more. It had fur, and that it looked like a wolf, but different. I wanted to tell him that it was the Michigan Dogman. I wanted to admit that after seeing what I did, I believed in those legends, but there was part of my brain that couldn't get those words out. I couldn't admit that the Michigan Dogman was actually real. Hank didn't respond right away. He just stood there. It was like he was trying to make sense of my words. I could see that he didn't want to believe me, but I wasn't making this up. I wasn't imagining it. And he knew that something had scared me. I needed him to see what I had seen, to understand the danger, but I wasn't sure how to make him believe it. So he spoke again. This time he was more gentle. He said we'll check it out in the morning. If something's out there, we'll deal with it. But right now, we just needed to make sure that the house was locked up tight. He told me that I seemed rattled and that I needed rest. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak anymore. I couldn't explain it any better, but I couldn't repeat myself either. Something in the pit of my stomach told me that whatever I saw wasn't gone, and that it wasn't just gonna leave. Hank and I spent the night in this uneasy silence, both of us listening for any sign of movement outside, but the night passed without incident. I stayed awake longer than I should have, staring out the window, half expecting to see that thing show up again, or hear it banging on the house. And the moonlight wasn't helping either, because it kept casting these long shadows across the yard, and it made everything seem like that creature was standing there. I couldn't shake the feeling that it really was out there, though. When the sun finally rose, I felt both relief and dread. The daylight didn't make the fear go away, but at least I wasn't alone in the house anymore. Hank went outside. He wanted to start the morning chores, but I wasn't in a hurry to follow him. I knew we needed to check around the property, but I wasn't sure I could face those woods again. But I knew I had to, at least for peace of mind. I grabbed a cup of coffee. I joined him outside, trying to act like nothing was wrong, but Hank didn't buy it. He could tell something was definitely off, though he hadn't said anything about what I told him the night before. We worked in silence for a while, going about the usual morning routine of feeding the cows and checking the garden. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to the creature that I'd seen the night before. It wasn't until we reached the back barn, near the tree line where I saw that thing, that Hank stopped in his tracks. I could see it on his face before he even spoke. His eyes were wide. His hand went up to his forehead, like he was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. I walked over to him. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. I needed to know. The sight of it stopped me cold dead in my tracks. There, next to the barn, were huge tracks. They were far too large to belong to any bear or wolf. The prints were deep, like something heavy had stepped on the ground with tremendous force. Each print had 5 toes, sharp-looking claws at the ends of each, and the size of them? Well, they were monstrous. Hank knelt down and inspected the prints, running his fingers over the edges and putting his hand against them. The size of those prints were twice the size of his hand. He didn't say anything for a long time, and I could tell he was trying to figure out what was going on, just like I had the night before. "This ain't no normal animal," he muttered, but I think it was more to himself than to me because he was so quiet. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I had no words left, just a cold, sick feeling in my stomach. I had seen the creature myself, and now the proof was right here in front of us, proof that Hank couldn't deny either. He didn't speak for a while. He just kept staring at those prints with this mix of confusion and fear on his face. It was then that I knew he understood. He might not have seen it for himself, but the evidence was clear. You couldn't dispute something like that was right in front of us. Whatever had been lurking around our farm was not just some kind of wild animal. It was something else. We didn't talk a long time after that. We spent the rest of the morning walking the property, looking for any signs of whatever it was, seeing if it was still prowling out in the woods. We didn't find anything else or any more prints, but none of that made us feel any better. That afternoon, Hank decided we needed to stay in for the rest of the day. He made sure everything was locked up tight, and we spent the evening in the house, keeping all the lights on and making sure all the windows were shut and locked too. I couldn't even look out of the windows without feeling like something was out there, waiting for us to slip up, and I had requested that we close all the curtains as well. He said yes, but he wanted one window up in the attic to remain open. That way he could watch for anything that was going on outside. So we made sure that that window was shut up tight, and we kept the curtain open. Every once in a while, he'd go up there and gaze out of it, making sure that that thing wasn't back. In the days that followed, Hank made sure to keep his hunting rifle close by, and we avoided the woods as much as possible. There was this sense of dread hanging over everything. We both knew it wasn't something we could ignore. We kept our distance from the back fields, and at night, we listened carefully for any sounds that didn't belong around there. In the end, we never saw it again. Not with our own eyes, anyway. But I know what I saw that night. I know those tracks were real, and every time I feel the quiet settling over the farm, I can't shake the thought that it could come back one day. It wasn't just a wild animal. It wasn't just a bad dream. It wasn't me misidentifying some kind of animal that should be out there. What I saw was something else entirely. And this is what I can take away from it. The Michigan Dogman is real. I was 16 years old when it happened. I was just a regular teenage girl, trying to get out of the house and enjoy a bike ride on a summer day. The year was 2003, and it was in Michigan. I didn't have a care in the world as I pedaled my old bike along the road that ran next to the cornfield. The road was a familiar one, just a few miles from my house actually, and I rode it often. There was nothing special about it, just a few scattered houses here and there, some barns, and a big cornfield that always seemed to stretch on forever. I liked riding my bike. It was a way to get away from everything. My parents were busy, and I didn't have a lot of friends who lived close by, so I'd hop on my bike, put on my headphones, and ride around for hours. That day I was listening to some old pop songs that I'd mixed a CD with. It wasn't anything fancy, but it kept me busy. I was riding along like I always did, and I was just starting to reach the stretch of road that ran alongside the cornfield. The corn was already really tall. They reached up so high that the tops of the plants were way above your head, and all I could see beyond was a sea of green. Nothing really looked out of place. The wind was blowing through the leaves, making them rustle softly, and it was peaceful, even a little relaxing. But then, something caught my eye. A flash of movement, just out of the corner of my vision. I glanced over at the cornfield and squinted, thinking maybe I'd just imagined it. But no, there was something there. Something I couldn't explain. I thought it might be a person, but that didn't make sense. There wasn't anyone else around, and besides, no one ever went out that far into the field, and it was just too far out of the way. I slowed my bike a bit and kept pedaling, trying to ignore it, but the feeling of this uneasiness just crept in. I wasn't sure, but I kept my focus straight ahead and kept going. But then I saw it again. A face. It was in the corn, way too high up to be a person. The face looked so out of place that that's what caught me off guard. Like something that shouldn't have been there. And it wasn't a person's face. Not exactly, anyway. But it was just close enough to make my heart start pounding in my chest. The eyes, wide and dark, were staring right at me. And they were the first thing that I noticed. And they were too big. I blinked and then I looked again, but the face was gone. Like it had never been there at all. But the feeling in my gut didn't go away. Something was out there. I couldn't shake the thought. My bike slowed down a bit on its own, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Something in my gut just told me that this was wrong. That the face had been up too high in the corn. So I kept going, trying to act normal, pretending like nothing was happening. But my hands were a little too shaky on the handlebars. I pushed the thoughts out of my head, trying to calm down so I wouldn't crash, and tried to focus on the road ahead. Even though I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following me, I still had to pilot the bike without eating shit, right? I glanced over once more in the field. It was just corn. Nothing was there. Nothing. But that feeling, well, the feeling just stayed with me. I tried to keep my head straight and focus on pedaling, but the more I tried to ignore it, the worse that it got. I couldn't shake that feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind in the corn had stopped, and the quiet around me made everything feel more eerie. And then I glanced over again. Just a quick look this time, hoping that maybe it was just a shadow or some small animal that was messing with me. But as soon as I turned my head, I saw it again. Just another flash, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. It was a face, peering out of the corn. This time, it was closer, or at least it felt like it was closer. I couldn't see the details too clearly, but I knew what I had seen. Something was watching me. I stopped my bike and froze for a second, unsure of what to do. My legs were stiff from fear, I guess. I didn't want to stop, but I needed to get a better look. What if it was just a person? Someone messing with me? But that couldn't be right either. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, standing in the corn like that? And why would they be so tall? And why would they just be waiting for someone to happen along? It seemed like a pretty lame prank. I snapped my head forward and started pedaling again, a little faster now. But I still felt like something was there with me. The road ahead was still empty, just a few twists and turns before it led back into the woods. But next to me, that's where it felt like some kind of presence was. My mind raced, spinning with all sorts of thoughts. I went faster. Now, I didn't want to look. I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I'd never be able to move again. But then, I saw something else. It was a shape moving quickly through the corn, barely visible in the tall stalks, but it was right next to me. It wasn't a person. It was too big and bulky, and the corn swayed in its wake. But this thing wasn't entirely visible. It was like it was trying to stay hidden, moving in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. So I did the only thing I could do. Pedaled faster, trying not to look over at the field again. But this thing kept pace with me, and I could hear it now, crunching the corn stalks as they were shifting with this thing's weight. It was still right out of my sight though, but it was close. Too close. I had no idea what it was, but I could feel it, right there in the corn, right next to me, watching me, messing with me. My legs started moving even faster, almost frantic, and I pushed through the pedal as hard as I could. But no matter how fast I went, this thing seemed to keep up with me, and I felt trapped. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, and the faster I pedaled, the more my legs burned. But I couldn't stop. I wasn't sure if I could ever outrun whatever this was, because no matter how fast I went, it picked up its pace. My heart was beginning to pound too hard, and sweat was starting to drip down my forehead. The bike started to feel heavy. Every push of the pedals seemed to make me fatigued. But my eyes were fixed on the road. If I looked at that thing, I could crash. But I knew that it was still following me. The sound of the rustling corn told me that. I felt like it was coming after me. I could hear thumping now, heavy footsteps moving through the corn, breaking the stalks. It was almost like a drum beat, steady and loud. And then I heard something else. Just for a split second, like something inhuman, something primal, grunting. The sound sent a cold shiver straight through me. My bike teetered and swerved as I lost focus, but my mind snapped back to the road, and I caught my balance before the bike could tip over. I pushed my legs even faster, faster than I ever thought even possible. And the bike started wobbling slightly under me because I was going so fast, but I was damn sure I was going to keep my balance. My hands were gripping the handlebar so tight that my knuckles actually hurt. My body screamed to stop, to take a breath, to slow down, but I couldn't. Not now. I had to keep going. If I stopped, I didn't know what was going to happen. The grunting came again, and I dared a quick glance to the side. I almost threw up. It was there. A face poking through the corn, but no face I ever dreamed I could ever see. It looked like a big wolf, up higher than the top of my head, and it was looking down at me. I only caught a glimpse of the front of it. It had a thick snout, teeth that were really sharp, poking out of the sides of its mouth. It had a big black nose, and it was wet, and these big-ass yellow eyes. The fur on its face was short but dark gray. And then it sort of shifted and it wasn't facing me anymore. When I saw that face looking at me through the corn, I screamed, and I desperately tried to put more distance between me and whatever that thing was. But it was fast, faster than I was, and I could hear it moving as I returned my gaze to the front. I needed to stay focused. I needed to keep the bike going. I needed to watch for anything that could cause my bike to crash. The fear was too much. I couldn't think straight. All I could do was keep moving, faster and faster, until I was afraid the bike was going to wobble so much that I was going to crash. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. If I did, it would catch me. I was so terrified. That type of terror you can't even describe unless you've actually felt it. But I knew that I had to get away. I knew that I had to keep moving. But the bike felt like it was slowing down because I was wearing out. The road turned a corner, and I wasn't sure if I could handle it. My bike swerved as I tried to make the turn without losing speed. The back tire skidded just a little, but I made it. I didn't crash. I didn't stop. But then I heard a crash behind me. Something heavy was smashing faster through the corn. My mind was too clouded with fear to look back again, though. I was moving too fast to chance a look. I heard this deep, unsettling howl, like something straight out of a nightmare. It was so close to me that it made my ears ring. My legs were giving out. The bike felt heavier and heavier, but still, I kept pushing myself. That fear, that terror, was the only thing that kept me going. But it was also so much that I was having a hard time focusing. All I knew was that I needed to get away. It was like everything else just went away, and the only thing that I was focused on was escaping. But that howl scared me so badly that I was starting to lose the fight. I felt like I couldn't do it anymore. I felt like my legs were going to give out. My mind was screaming, telling me to go faster, to get away, but my body was telling me to slow down. That exhaustion is overwhelming. When you're moving that fast for that long, and you have that type of fear in you, there's not much that you could do to keep control over your body. The cornfield. It seemed endless. I was trapped in it, stuck on this road, with that thing chasing me. I didn't look anymore, but I could still hear it growling, and I could still hear the sound of the corn stalks snapping. I could see corn rustling just ahead of me, bending and breaking under something heavy. And I knew that I was about to be caught. I could feel it. I couldn't outrun this thing. Everything that I'd pushed myself to achieve was in vain. There wasn't anything I could do anymore. And I knew now it was passing me, and it was in front of me. That growling turned into a snarl. That sound, it wasn't just a warning. It seemed like some kind of threat. It was telling me that it was too late to run. That I was gonna die. The feeling of being hunted, of being prey, it's an all-consuming kind of fear. I don't know how many people listening have been in a situation where some kind of predator has you backed up against the wall and you think it's gonna attack and kill you. But if you have, you know what I'm talking about. It makes you feel helpless, and it consumes you. At that point, I could barely keep the balance on my bike. If I stopped, I knew that I wouldn't make it. If I kept going, I knew I probably still wasn't going to make it. But I wasn't going to be an easy meal. Up ahead, there was a break in the cornfield. Just a small opening. It was narrow, but it was there. I pushed harder and harder. Harder than I'd ever pushed myself before. My legs, they felt like they were somebody else's now because they were numb. My mind was focused only on that break in the corn. If I could make it to that opening, I might have a chance to get away. I swerved towards it. My tires wobbled so much I was sure I wasn't going to stay up, but with one final push, I tore towards that opening. My bike started bouncing over this uneven ground, but I kept going. I felt like I was the best pilot in the world at that moment. I was almost there, just a few feet away, but as I pushed forward, I heard a loud, gut-wrenching roar. It was so loud, it felt like it rattled the bike itself, and it seemed like it was coming from all around me at once. I made the mistake of glancing back again. In that moment, I saw it. The whole towering form. The thing that had been chasing me. The Dogman. It stood just outside of the corn, but still half hidden by the stalks. Its massive shoulders were clearly visible, though. The face was awful, and the snarl that it gave me, well, let's just say I no longer had to go to the bathroom. Even in that quick glance, I could see those long, sharp teeth. I could see the body was covered in thick fur like a wolf. It was something straight out of a nightmare. I don't know what happened in that moment. My brain couldn't seem to process it. All I knew was that I had to get away. I turned my head back towards the opening, and with everything I had, I pushed my bike through. The front tire caught on something, maybe a root or a rock, and for a split second, I thought I was going to fall. But I didn't. I righted myself just in time to keep going. My body was moving just as fluidly as that creature that was chasing me. I was going on instinct alone. Just pure survival mode. The road was so close now. I was almost there. I was almost there. Almost there, almost there, almost there. So close. Just a few more yards. Then I could be free. I could still feel it behind me. I could hear it too. The ground felt uneven beneath my tires, and my bike was starting to feel heavier than I could ever imagine it feeling. The road was so clear, though. I felt like I might make it. I had to reach it. I had to get out of the cornfield. The road felt like freedom, but the growling behind me felt like the end. I turned the corner onto the road, and the moment my tires hit the pavement, I felt a rush of relief. When I hit the pavement, something changed. The growling stopped. The sound of footsteps stopped. I thought it might be gone. I wanted to believe that it was gone. I wanted to believe that I'd outrun it. But still, I didn't slow down. I couldn't afford to slow down. I kept going forever. My legs moving on instinct, pushing harder and harder until I reached the next bend in the road and collapsed. I was in front of somebody's house now. Whose it was, I didn't know. I didn't care. I just knew that people were in there and I wasn't alone. I was dizzy, lightheaded. I felt like I was gonna throw up. But you know what? I was alive. At that point, I didn't know what that thing was or what it wanted. It wasn't until later that I read about the Dogman during a sleepless night. After that chase, I've had a lot of those. I don't really remember the ride home. I think that's when the shock set in, and I could finally put my mind a little bit at ease. But I made it back, and I went right upstairs to the shower. I was drenched in sweat, and I think showering was my way of disconnecting what had happened. In the shower is when I broke down. I felt like I cried for hours after that. It took a long time to learn how to deal with that. Sometimes I still get jumpy, and I definitely stay away from cornfields. And scary movies, too. But that's all I got for you. I hope this one at least entertains the subs that you have. Thank you for sharing it for me. Christa. It's funny how one ordinary day can change your whole outlook on life. I wasn't someone who believed in monsters or anything like that. I was just a guy who worked hard, liked a quiet life, and didn't ask for trouble. But sometimes, trouble finds you, no matter how careful you are. This happened back in the fall of 1985. I was 27 at the time, living in a little house outside of Traverse City, Michigan. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I liked the peace and quiet of being a bit away from town. I worked as a mechanic, mostly on tractors and farm equipment. Folks around there knew me as a steady and reliable person, and that's just how I liked it. Nothing flashy, nothing crazy, just a normal, quiet life. That day started like any other. I'd been working on a neighbor's old John Deere most of the afternoon. Around 5:30, I decided to wrap it up and take a drive to clear my head. Sometimes I like to take the back roads, just me and my old Chevy pickup, letting the stress of the day just fall away. The sun was setting as I drove. The sky was shades of orange and red. I turned down a gravel road that I hadn't taken in a while. It was one of those roads that snaked through dense patches of forest, the kind where the trees seemed to lean in close like they were trying to hide the road from the sky. It was peaceful in a way, with the crunch of the gravel under my tires and the hum of the engine. About 20 minutes in, I saw a little clearing up ahead, and something about it just caught my eye. It was one of those places that looked like it had been once an important part of the life, but was long forgotten. There was an old, run-down barn sitting off to the side, and its roof was half caved in, and the wood was weathered to gray. The fields around it were overgrown with weeds and taller than me in some spots. I decided to stop, not for any particular reason, just curiosity, I guess. I pulled over, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled earthy, like wet leaves and dirt, and it was quiet. But, now that I think back on it, too quiet. I walked up to the barn, peeking through the gaps in the old broken boards. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. Inside, I could make out old farm tools, a rusted plow, and stacks of rotting hay. The whole place had this eerie feel to it, but I shrugged it off. I actually kind of liked it. Places like that always gave this ghostly vibe that just heightened my curiosity, I guess. Then I heard what I thought was a big dog growling, and it made me pause. I wasn't looking to have any run-in with some stray. I'd been bitten a few years ago by a shepherd, and it messed my arm up bad enough to where I needed stitches. I guess I was having some of that PTSD about it. The growl actually sent a chill right through me, and I froze, listening hard. I heard it again, and even though at first I thought it might be a big dog or a coyote, something about it just didn't sit right with me. For one thing, it sounded big, whatever it was, and the sound of the growling was rougher. It sounded like it was right behind the side of the barn, too. I took a step back from the barn, looking around, but I didn't see anything. The woods were thick, and the shadows were long, making it hard to tell what was what. The growl came one more time, but this time it just sounded angrier to me, like it was warning me to get away, and it was followed by some kind of sound that made my blood run cold. It was like something big, with heavy footsteps, was running around the side of the barn, and it was coming straight towards me. The sound of it made me realize that whatever type of dog this was, it was a big one. So I started backing away quickly to my truck, keeping my eyes on the barn, expecting some really big, pissed-off dog to come around the side. Well, you can imagine how I reacted when this monster came around the corner on two legs instead. It stepped out into the open, and I swear my heart stopped for a second. It was huge, at least 2 feet taller than me, maybe more. For the record, I'm 6'1". This thing was covered in long, shaggy fur just like a wolf, and the same coloring too. Grays and tans with some white. Its body was muscular, like a predator built to hunt. And like I said, it was walking on 2 legs, just like a man. But this was not a man. Its head was like a wolf's, with pointed ears and a long snout. Its eyes were this unnatural amber color, and its hands were clawed, with long sharp nails that looked like they were meant for grabbing prey and slashing it open for the kill. I didn't move. I didn't want to run and give it a reason to chase me. I'd wished I'd brought my gun with me. It might not have done much to this thing though, but at least it might have been a distraction. So I just stood there, staring at this thing. It bobbed its head back and forth and snarled. I saw this big, thick pink tongue in its mouth. It let out a roar that I could literally feel, and it raised both arms up and brought them down against the side of the barn so hard I could hear wood splinter. After it struck the barn, it turned its head to me and let out the most intimidating growl that I've ever heard, and bared these teeth that were even worse than the claws. Everything about this beast said one thing to me. Super predator. Top of the food chain. Fearless. That's when I knew I was in real trouble. I almost couldn't stop myself from running, but I knew better. Predators liked that. They chase things that run. So I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on it and trying to make myself look as unthreatening as possible. But this thing just stepped closer. Slowly. Like it was testing me or trying to get me to submit. I could see its muscles rippling under the fur and its claws flexed like it was getting ready to pounce on me. I kept backing up until I felt the hood of my truck behind me. My hand fumbled for the door handle, but I didn't take my eyes off of the creature. It let out another snarl, louder this time, and I knew I was out of time. In one quick motion, I turned around, yanked the door open, jumped in and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I saw the thing take a few running steps after me before stopping, dropping to all fours, and running in a circle around my truck. I thought about hitting it, but I wasn't tempting fate. As it made a second lap around my truck, it started making this weird barking noise, or a yipping noise. When it passed behind the truck, I gunned it backwards, straight past it, gravel spraying all over the place. I drove in reverse and it gave chase for about 30 feet before stopping. And then it made this weird galloping run towards the barn, stopped halfway there and galloped back towards the gravel road. I stopped, slammed it into drive and spun around, away from this thing, but as I did, I watched it actually push off of the ground with its front hands and get back up on the rear legs. And then I just stood there, watching as I sped away. I didn't try to stop. I didn't stop until I was home. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains tight, and sat in the dark with a shotgun across my lap. I didn't sleep that night, and for weeks after, I couldn't shake that fear. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. I didn't want to think about what I saw. And who'd believe me anyway? Folks around here are practical. They're no-nonsense types. They'd laugh me out of town if I started talking about monsters in the woods. But I know what I saw, and no amount of skepticism can change that. I spent a lot of time at the bars after that, just dwelling on it. And then a couple years after I saw that damn thing, that damn song came out. You know the one. The legend. Steve Cook. If you haven't heard it, go listen to it. That song sent me right back to the drink. Now he says he made up the song on a whim, but I'm not so sure about that. Too many similarities. That damn thing is really out there. I moved to Nevada in the mid-90s, tried to get as far away from the legend as I could. Met a nice woman there, had a couple kids, got a desk job. Got some grandbabies now too. Just nice and normal. I told her about it, but I don't ever bring it up anymore. My kids know, but they also know not to talk about it to me. It's just too much. It's a rare occasion for me to open up about it, but my boy is a subscriber to you and a couple other people. I guess my story sparked a fascination in him the first time he heard it. He wanted me to type this up and send it to you, so here I am sitting here with some Jim Beam and a laptop, trying not to dwell on it too much. Sometimes I wonder if this Dogman creature is some kind of mutant animal, or a creature that science hasn't discovered yet. Other times, I think it was something worse. Something that doesn't belong to this world. Some things are better left alone. And that's one lesson I'll never forget.